16 states now suing President Trump over his declaration of a national emergency to fund the border wall. The president responding today at the White House.
If our nation doesn't have borders, we don't have too much of a nation, especially when drugs and all of the things that you know better than anybody, what's happening at the border. It's a bad situation. So I think we're going to do very well with the lawsuit.
Let's bring in litigation attorney Seth Berenzweig. Seth, what do you make of this 16-state lawsuit?
Well, it's a very interesting case where 16 states, through the attorneys general, are asserting that the president has committed an unconstitutional overreach of his executive powers. It's based principally on an argument for an unconstitutional violation of the separation of powers, and I think that the president probably has a bit of an uphill battle here. Obviously, it's a very critical issue that's going to get a lot of attention, but on the law, there have been arguments made that it violates the separation of powers principles, and frankly, on the facts, I think that the president's lawyers did not serve him very well on the day that he announced and rolled it out. The other side has latched on to his comments, saying that it really is not something that he needed to do right away. It almost created the appearance that his legal team in the White House was out having a 3-martini lunch that day because they didn't exactly give him a lot of guidance on this. In the first phase of this, at least, the president's going to face a bit of an uphill legal battle.
Seth, John Layfield here. First of all, there's nothing wrong with a 3-martini lunch, so you don't need to be a hater, okay? Second, I want to ask you, this seems like a nightmare scenario, no matter what you think about the wall, because if the president invokes eminent domain to get this land from these ranchers on the border to build the wall, what happens if then, and say he takes money also and transfers that money to be used to build that wall, what happens to that money that is transferred, and what happens to that land if it is taken through eminent domain, if the president loses this legal battle and then can't do any of it?
Well, you've identified a really interesting and critical aspect of this, because there are other challenges that are coming where individual landowners are going to challenge on exactly the scenario that you just identified. And there's a concept here called the issue of legal standing that is going to be a very live issue that the president's lawyers are going to be filing as a defense to the case that has been filed by the 16 states. So when you have people that lose land because of eminent domain, that's a direct personal injury that they sustain. The president's lawyers will be coming in on the main case that we're talking about and saying that the states lack legal standing because their claims of loss and harm are a little bit too attenuated. I think at the end of the day that the court's going to make a close call on that and say that the states have probably shown some kind of standing here, at least for the outside of the case. But I think you've identified an Achilles heel that the president's lawyers are going to be attacking when they come out of the gate on the case that's currently pending in San Francisco.
Seth, it's Kevin Kelly here, and I think it's pretty interesting that we're not talking about the national security concerns, and all of a sudden you look at that California already has a border wall. Arizona has a border wall. They're not part of this. But aren't the courts going to look at this case and give deference to the president over national security concerns and say, hey, listen, there's already a border wall, and so we're going to have to give presidential deference in this situation?
Yes, absolutely. As a part of the background in this case, there is the long-standing deference that federal courts provide to the President of the United States on matters related to national security. Therefore, even if the president loses at the trial court level, or even at the Ninth Circuit, which the president has already tongue-in-cheek said that it's probably going to happen, it will probably end up at the Supreme Court. And there, the Supreme Court's going to be talking about exactly the issue that you've identified right now. So let's take a look at who is now on the Supreme Court. Let's take a look, for example, at Justice Kavanaugh. From what we've seen at the hearings and in his writings, we know that there's two things that Justice Kavanaugh really likes: beer and expansive executive authority. And I believe that if you're going to end up in a close vote in the United States Supreme Court, the deference that you just talked about might end up being the delineation line of where we end up in the final chapter of this constitutional legal battle.
Although we had an appropriations that took place on a bipartisan basis with Senator Shelby leading and Chairwoman Nita Lowey leading, and they did not give the president border money. They just didn't give him as much money as he wanted. So it's not necessarily the national defense challenge, it's the check and balance of the purse. And where I would actually say, what I also think is what's interesting is the two lead Republicans in the House from Texas, Congressman Hurd and Congressman Thornberry. Thornberry from military, he was the chair of the armed services, and Congressman Hurd, who actually I think has 40% of the border, they both oppose this. It just seems a little strange to me that the two big Republicans in Texas oppose this.
You know, it's very interesting to watch what's happening in the Congress, and I agree with you that there's going to be a lot of interesting developments on Capitol Hill in the coming days, because while we have this activity going on in the federal court in California, we're going to be seeing voting on Capitol Hill in both chambers as to whether or not there's going to be a counterbalance and a vote that will initially be by majority vote, which the president can then force a two-thirds majority vote to override a presidential veto. So I think you're going to be seeing a lot of dynamics happening both on the Hill as well as in the federal court. And the other thing that I think that you pointed out, which is interesting, is that these attorneys general didn't really rely very heavily on the national security statutes under the Emergencies Act. They really are turning this into a seminar on constitutional separation of powers. They're not going squarely into the president's authority under the Emergencies Act to declare national emergencies and military construction. However, I think when the president's lawyers go in there, they're going to try to steer the ship in that direction, because at the end of the day, that's going to be more firm territory for the president's legal arguments.
Seth Berenzweig, you are a wealth of information, and we thank you very much.